Chapter 8. The Widening of the Gap. When I returned to Salt Pond, where I had succeeded in renting fresh premises, I found that things were not going at all well as regards the office management. I therefore approached the working committee and asked if they would appoint a committee from among them to come and investigate matters and submit their recommendations as to what improvements could be made in the running of the office. They appeared to be very keen to help me in this, and at once appointed a two-man committee composed of Abetsabi Lamptey and William Ofori-Atta. They timed their visit to Salt Pond when I was away on a party rally. On my return, I was met by an extremely agitated chief clerk, who related to me all that had happened. It appeared that the office management was the last thing that these two men were interested in. They made straight for the files and scrutinized all the correspondence that had taken place, impatiently turning over pages until they found something of interest. My chief clerk looked on horrified as they took possession of whatever they fancied, especially when they confiscated certain letters that he had typed for my signature. These letters were quite harmless, but because I had used the word comrade in several cases, they presumably jumped on them as proof positive in their minds that I was a communist. Another letter which they impounded and which caused such a stir among them was from one of our members, in which he told me that he knew of a way whereby the convention could be vested with supernatural powers, and that if I would contact him on the subject, he would be prepared to use his influence to achieve this. My reply to this gentleman was that if he possessed such powers, I felt that the best thing would be for him to appear personally before the working committee of the UGCC and put his case before them. In due course, I was faced with various charges by the working committee. As I expected, they were fearfully excited about the word comrade. To them, the word was obviously synonymous with communism. "Is this not proof that he is a communist?" they asked. Astounded at such ignorance, I said nothing, but waited to hear what else they had to say. They expressed their objection to my reply to the second letter on the grounds that I should have submitted the man's letter to them before replying to it, that I had, in fact, acted outside of my authority. Then they brought up the matter of my secretary, Saki Shek, accusing me of paying him his salary of £4 a month out of the coffers of the convention. It became obvious that they were determined to rid themselves of me at all costs. The limit of my patience was exceeded when they drew their final grievance out the bag. They strongly objected, they said, to my founding of the Ghana College, because by doing so I had acted outside of my authority by not consulting them beforehand on the matter, and the formation of such a school was in any case outside the regulations of the Education Department. I was flabbergasted. "Are you trying to tell me that you were not consulted on this matter? Are you also implying that the formation of the Ghana College was not in the interests of most of you personally and of the UGCC as a whole?" I proceeded to refresh their memories on the subject. When I and my 5 colleagues were detained in the Northern Territories, a number of students from various colleges and secondary schools went on strike in sympathy with us. As a result of this, they were expelled. When I was released and returned to Salt Pond, the parents of these expelled students came to me in desperation, beseeching me to do something for their children. I reminded the working committee that, after putting the matter before them, they set up a committee, of which I was a member, to look into the matter. The committee drew up a memorandum which we submitted to the working committee, recommending that either a school should be established to accommodate these unfortunate students, or that a way should be found to admit them to existing secondary schools throughout the country. By your indifference to these recommendations, I continued, you demonstrated very clearly that you had little interest in what became of these students. You had conveniently forgotten that it was on account of the injustice that was being meted out to you that these boys, by expressing active sympathy, are in their present predicament. I told them that it was purely to protect the good name of the UGCC, which had been endangered by their actions, that I took it upon myself to take action. And don't go away with the mistaken idea that I did this for personal gain. On the contrary, the project cost me much in money, time, and energy. Now that I had got them where I wanted, I decided to acquaint them further with facts about the establishment of this college. I managed to hire the Oddfellows Hall on McCarthy Hill in Cape Coast for 8 shillings a month. Here the students were housed. I then arranged for 3 teachers who had been expelled from their posts for the same reasons to come and teach the boys. Owing to a lack of funds, these men agreed to work without pay until such time as the finances of the school were established. From my salary of £25 a month, I spent £10 on kerosene tins, packing cases, and boards to serve as seats and desks for the first batch of 10 students, who ranged in standard from grades 1 to 6. It is a pity, I told the members of the working committee, that you were not present at the opening ceremony. You would have been deeply touched. Only Charles Dickens could have aptly described the scene. But one did not notice the bare boards, the kerosene tins, and the packing cases. The sun was shining too brightly on the face of those grateful students and tutors. Take my word for it, they will succeed and the college will expand, for it has firm foundations of courage and determination. How well I remember that scene on the morning of the 20th of July, 1948. I spoke without notes for about 10 minutes. In fact, most of my speeches at the time were extemporaneous. It was, as I remarked in the opening words of my speech, an informal opening on very modest lines. Apart from a few friends of the masters and some of the parents of the students who had got wind of the ceremony, nobody had been invited. When the formal opening of the college takes place, I encouraged them, that will be the occasion to invite the public to witness the launching of an educational enterprise which may prove a significant landmark when the history of our hectic times comes to be written. I explained that it was the task of the Ghana National College to liberate the minds of our youth so that they should be ready to tackle the many problems of our time. Throughout history, I went on, great things have often had small beginnings. I quoted as an example the founding by Booker T. Washington of the Tuskegee Institute and its growth from one people to thousands. In establishing the Ghana National College, we have taken upon ourselves a grave responsibility, I continued. The times are changing and we must change with them. In doing so, we must combine the best in Western culture with the best in African culture. The magic story of human achievement gives irrefutable proof that as soon as an awakened intelligentsia emerges among so-called subject people, it becomes the vanguard of the struggle against alien rule. It provides the nucleus of the dominant wish and aspiration, the desire to be free to breathe the air of freedom which is theirs to breathe. If we cannot find breadth of outlook and lofty patriotism in our schools and colleges, where else, in the name of humanity, can we find them? The African today is conscious of his capabilities. Educational and cultural backwardness is the result of historical conditions. I then urged all present and future students, both boys and girls, for I hoped the college would become co-educational, to consider laziness as a crime. Think, study hard, work with sustained effort, I said. As never before, we want thinkers, thinkers of great thoughts. We want doers, doers of great deeds. Of what use is your education if you cannot help your country in her hour of need? In spite of the humble conditions under which we have started, I said, I bring you a message of hope and inspiration. I bid you shake hands with yourselves and your teachers over your study tables, and before the blackboards. I look forward to the time when there will be a chain of Ghana colleges in all the 4 territories which make up the Gold Coast, leading up to the founding of the University of Ghana. In the name of the people of the Gold Coast, I concluded, in the name of humanity and in the name of Almighty God, I bid you go farewell, till we realize a free and united Gold Coast in a united West Africa. Sure enough, the Ghana College thrived. A year later, the number of students had increased to 230, and there were over 1,000 names on the waiting list. Following on the early success of this college, I later founded over a dozen Ghana national secondary schools and colleges throughout the country. But the working committee were not at all grateful for what I had achieved in the name of the convention. They continued to complain bitterly about the whole thing. Still nursing their grievances, they suggested to me that I should resign my post as General Secretary and that I should be given £100 to buy a one-way ticket to the United Kingdom and carry on there where I left off. I challenged this and once more denied their charges, which I told them I considered to be cooked up. It had some effect, and certain members of the committee began to waver. They feared that my removal from the UGCC might cause the complete breakdown of the movement. They could not blind themselves to the fact that I had a strong personal following, and they were beginning to consider me as a key man in the survival of the movement. They therefore proposed that instead of my removal, I should be offered the post of treasurer. I accepted this, for it suited my purpose well enough, and more important, it completely defeated the purpose of the working committee. As far as the rank and file of the UGCC were concerned, the intentions of the working committee appeared highly illogical. They felt that I was considered to be unworthy of the job of General Secretary and incapable of managing the affairs of the convention. How was it that I was considered suitable to take the job of Treasurer? And coupled with this, the words of Dankwa were still fresh in their minds. If all of us fail you, Kwame Nkrumah will never fail you. They argued that if Dankwa could be bold enough to assert this at 2 mass rallies in Sekondi and Accra, how then could he denounce the same Kwame Nkrumah in the very next breath? Moreover, to the embarrassment of the working committee, they made their protest manifest by the hundreds of letters and telegrams that poured into the office of the UGCC. The working committee had many headaches as far as I was concerned, and it was no doubt because they feared the truth of certain suspicions they had about me that they acted so hastily and made such a fiasco of their attempt to dismiss me. For instance, they would certainly have heard some kind of rumor about the birth of my newspaper. For the whole time that I was General Secretary of the movement, I had done my utmost to impress upon the working committee the importance of establishing a newspaper as an organ of the movement. They would not hear of it, and their excuse being that we would probably get ourselves embroiled in sedition cases. Personally, I failed to see how any liberation movement could possibly succeed without an effective means of broadcasting its policy to the rank and file of the people. In the same way as I took the initiative over the Ghana colleges, so I made plans to launch a newspaper. I arranged to purchase by installments a copper printing machine, which an Accra printer allowed me to install in his Alsco press printing office. With the help of an assistant editor and 4 boys to operate the machine, the first edition of my newspaper, the Accra Evening News, appeared on the 3rd of September 1948, on the very same day that the working committee had relieved me of my post as General Secretary. From the beginning, the Accra Evening News became the vanguard of the movement and its chief propagandist, agitator, mobilizer, and political educationist. Day by day in its pages, the people were reminded of their struggle for freedom, of the decaying colonial system, and of the grim horrors of imperialism. At first, owing to the lack of funds, we could only print a single sheet containing feature articles, an editorial, an agitators column, and the most dreaded and talked about column headed Rambler. There were no limits to the Rambler's jottings. His eyes and ears were everywhere, and he had no hesitation in exposing whom he pleased. A certain doctor was heard to remark that it was quite impossible to hold even a private conversation with one's wife in one's own room without Rambler reporting on it. I remember too that an American newspaper man who visited the Gold Coast at the time offered £1,000 for the chance to meet Rambler. The demand for the paper was so great that the limited edition we were able to produce on our small machine was avidly awaited by the crowds, and copies were passed from hand to hand as if they were currency notes, the exchange invariably increasing the value of the paper until it was often being sold for sixpence a copy. Even those unable to read would gather themselves into group while a literate person read the sheet to them from beginning to end. The mottos appearing as part of the heading soon became household words. We prefer self-government with danger to servitude in tranquility. We have the right to live as men. We have the right to govern ourselves. In spite of its popularity, we made no profit, for all the money received from the sales was utilized in paying the employees and in buying newsprint and other equipment with which to carry on. We refused to accept any advertisements for fear that the advertisers might try to influence the policy of the paper. In any case, most of the people who could afford to advertise were the imperialist and capitalist merchants who would not in any case have been willing to associate themselves with our paper. When the working committee saw how valuable the Accra Evening News had become in furthering political agitation, they founded a weekly paper of their own called the Ghana Statesman. This disappeared a few months after its first publication and was followed by the National Times and another paper called Talking Drums. But these, like the Ghana Statesman, soon became defunct. The Evening News, however, proved such a success that in January 1949 I established the Morning Telegraph in Sekondi, with Kwame Nkrumah as its editor, and followed this up with the Cape Coast Daily Mail in December of that year, edited by Kofi Bako, who is now my ministerial secretary and the government chief whip. On the 6th of September 1948, after I had set the wheels of the Accra Evening News in motion, and because of the tension in the country on account of my removal from the general secretaryship of the UGCC, I decided to go away for a holiday to the French Ivory Coast and French Guinea. In a way, it was a busman's holiday, for one of my many reasons in going to these countries was to cover the ground that I had been forced to bypass on my outward voyage. West African unity was still uppermost in my thoughts. I renewed my acquaintance with many of my friends of London days, who were then deputies of the French National Assembly, and had a very successful trip. On my return, however, I found that the Accra Evening News was in financial difficulties. Because it had not been possible to pay the printer for the use of his office, even though the agreement had been that we would pay him off as soon as we had made sufficient funds from the sale of the newspaper, he had decided to take over the entire finances, and there was no money at all with which to pay the operators of the copper machine. There was nothing for it but to look for fresh premises, which were eventually found in Horse Road, the premises that have remained the headquarters of this newspaper to this day. It became a common saying in the country that if you wanted to know the truth, you should read the Accra Evening News. Unfortunately, we were too outspoken, and in next to no time I found myself involved in libel cases, and the claims being made against me amounting to around £10,000. All the claimants were civil servants and included the Commissioner of Police. I was not worried. I had no property to be impounded. I had nothing for them to seize except 2 suits, a couple of shirts, and a pair of shoes. There was no bankruptcy law in the country. The mass of the people who supported me wholeheartedly in the matter came to my aid and managed to collect enough money to meet the claim of the Commissioner of Police and a few others who insisted on immediate payment. The rest were paid off over a period of time. It was not until I became Prime Minister, however, that I learnt from some of the less prominent people who had filed libel suits against me that they had been prompted and even urged to do so by certain government officials who apparently hoped that by entangling me in such a mass of debt and legal action, I would be overcome, and together with my evening news would pass out into oblivion. At a later date, Dankwa brought an action against the Accra Evening News for libel in connection with an article that was written about the Kibi ritual murder case. He was awarded damages, but not content with this, he bought the rights of the paper. Luckily, we moved one step ahead. The head press, as it then was immediately taken over by the heel press, which continued to publish the same newspaper under a new name, Ghana Evening News. The thing that rankled the working committee most strongly, however, was the fact that I was responsible for establishing the Youth Study Group, which was later embodied in a national youth movement within the Ashanti Youth Association, and the Ghana Youth Association of Sekondi, and known as the Committee on Youth Organization. Ever since the first indication of the divergence of views between myself and the members of the UGCC during our detention together, I knew that sooner or later a final split would have to come. I was determined, therefore, to organize things in such a way that when this break came, I would have the full support of the masses behind me. By gathering together the youth of Osu, a district of Accra, I formed the Youth Study Group. Owing to the fact that I was too busy with my duties as the then General Secretary of the UGCC, I did not want to tie myself down as chairman of this group, even though I was at the helm. It was therefore agreed that Komla Bedema, now Minister of Finance with whom I was living in Accra, should be the chairman. Our meetings were held regularly at Bedema's house. The aim of the Committee on Youth Organization was not to work against the working committee of the UGCC, but rather to form itself into a youth section on the national movement. It was intended as a spur to further the cause of this movement. The members of the working committee, however, objected strongly to its formation. They felt that with its program of self-government now, the youth were becoming too critical of their program. The UGCC's program was self-government within the shortest possible time. But basically, they opposed it because it was composed of the less privileged or radical section of the people and voiced the economic, social, and political aspirations of the rank and file. It went completely against their more conservative outlook. They thought, and rightly so, that I had been responsible for this organization of the youth, and this fact strengthened their desire to remove me from office. Unfortunately for them, they disclosed their intention of doing this and thereby brought about an open conflict between the supporters of the CYO within the UGCC and the working committee. It became obvious to all that these men who had until that moment complete control of the national movement were anxious to be rid of me because I represented the radical and progressive section of the movement. With all this unpleasantness brewing up again, I decided to make a short trip to Nzima, where in the peace of my home surroundings I hoped to be able to restore in some measure my equilibrium. I knew that the time was fast approaching when decisive action was going to be necessary, when in all probability control would be in my hands, and I realized how important it was to plan my next steps. During my absence, Komla Bedema arranged for a mass meeting of the Committee on Youth Organization in the King George V Memorial Hall. It had been advertised that I was to address the meeting. I knew nothing about this, and as the day for the meeting drew near, the organizers became more and more anxious that I would not arrive back in Accra in time, and that the crowd would be disappointed. In desperation, therefore, Bedema set off from Accra on the evening before the day the meeting was to be held, and drove his old car as fast as it would towards Nzima. When he arrived at the Ankoba River and was waiting for the canoe to ferry him across, it just so happened that at the very same time I was standing on the opposite bank, about to get into the canoe. The ferryman complained that there was some impatient chap on the other bank who appeared to be trying to find somebody. At first I didn't take any notice, but suddenly, across the water, I recognized Bedema's voice calling out my name. I immediately shouted back in reply, much to the consternation of the ferryman, who, I suppose, thought that there must have been two madmen at large. It was 4 o'clock in the morning. Without wasting any more time, Bedema hurriedly pushed me into his car, and while he steered it round hairpin bends at a speed far too great for its age, he proceeded to tell me about the meeting and how important it was that I should be there. We arrived in Accra at about 3:15, just before the meeting was due to begin. The hall was packed to capacity with Europeans and Africans in all walks of life. I spoke to them for almost 2 hours on the subject of the liberty of the colonial subject. It was a most successful meeting from many points of view, for by charging admittance to the meeting we collected £200 for the funds of the CYO. Soon after this, we made arrangements to hold a Ghana Youth Conference in Kumasi from the 23rd to the 26th of December 1948. To this conference, all sections of the country's youth were invited. On the very day that the conference was due to be held, however, it was announced on the radio that because it was felt that it might lead to a breach of the peace, the meeting had been banned by the police. Owing to the lateness of the announcement, many people had already set out for Kumasi, and we therefore got together all those who had arrived and held an informal and secret session which lasted the whole night. At that meeting we drew up the Ghana Youth Manifesto, which was published under the title Toward Self-Government. The manifesto set out the form of a constitution which the CYO thought could be used as such a basis for discussion by the Kusi Committee which was due to sit that month, and a copy of it was sent to them for this purpose. It was then decided that we should send cablegrams to the Colonial Office protesting against the banning of the conference. We realized that it was impossible to send these off from Kumasi, or indeed from anywhere else inside the Gold Coast, so we set out at once for Lome in French Togoland, more than 300 miles away. When we arrived, we discovered the word about us had arrived there as well, and it was equally impossible to dispatch the cables from Lome, so we had to post our protest by airmail. On the way back, the taxi that we had hired broke down about 90 miles from Accra. After waiting on the roadside for an interminable time, while all those who claimed even the faintest mechanical knowledge endeavored to demonstrate their skill, a hopeful noise came from the engine. With a little persuasion, the car condescended to move a few yards, then, with a splatter of protest, gave up again. After several such performances, the driver decided that the only thing to do was to treat the thing with care. This meant a crawl at snail pace in low gear. It was just about the most tiring journey that I have ever made, and after 8 hours we arrived in Accra utterly exhausted. We had arranged for another conference of the CYO to be held about 3 weeks before Easter in order to prepare for the youth for the Easter conference of the UGCC. We might have saved ourselves the trouble, however, for when the UGCC held their Easter conference at Salt Pond, instead of following their scheduled program, the members of the working committee concentrated all their attention and energy first in demanding the immediate dismissal of my private secretary on the grounds that he had been appointed by me without their prior approval and was being paid out of the convention funds, and second in refusing to reinstate me as general secretary of the party. The conference dispersed, and the seeds of bitterness which had already been sown between the working committee and the CYO took deeper root. By June 1949, the CYO held a special conference in Tarkwa, which was attended by all the youth organizations in the country. The discussions that took place lasted for about 3 nights and proceeded into the early hours of the morning. There were 2 matters under discussion: whether they should acquiesce to my removal from the General Secretaryship of the UGCC, and whether the time had arrived to turn the CYO into a real political party. As far as the first point was concerned, it was eventually decided to resist my removal from office. The second matter was more difficult. The younger elements among the youth, led by Kofi Bako and Saki Shek, were opposed to the formation of a political party as they insisted by remaining within the UGCC, the CYO would eventually capture the initiative. The other section, headed by Kojo Botsio, Komlo Bedema, and Zenkle Zeru, a staunch supporter who later defected, maintained that under the circumstances the CYO should immediately capture the political initiative of the rank and file from the UGCC by completely breaking away from that movement and forming itself into a separate political party. The matter was then referred to me. I had no hesitation whatsoever in making my final ruling. I pointed out that having had ample experience of the policy and mentality of the members of the working committee, anything short of the formation of a political party to lead the rank and file of the people at the earliest possible moment would be disastrous. The day we appointed for the launching of this new political party was the 12th of June 1949. Much discussion took place on the name to be given to this party. The most popular suggestion was made the Ghana People's Party. This would have been adopted but for one vital reason. Owing to the fact that the rank and file of the people had learnt to associate my name with that of the United Gold Coast Convention, I felt that omitting the word convention from the name of this new party, it would arouse doubt and suspicion in the minds of the people who would regard it as a completely new party with new ideas and new promoters. And so, in order to carry the masses with us, we all agreed at all costs convention must appear as part of the new name. The name that we eventually agreed upon was the Convention People's Party. We then drew up a 6-point program for the CPP, which was as follows. Point 1. To fight relentlessly by all constitutional means for the full achievement of self-government now for the chiefs and people of the Gold Coast. Point 2. To serve as the vigorous, conscious political vanguard for removing all forms of oppression and for the establishment of a democratic government. Point 3. To secure and maintain the complete unity of the chiefs and people of the colony, Ashanti, Northern Territories, and Transvolta. Point 4. To work in the interest of the trade union movement in the country for better conditions of employment. Point 5. To work for a proper reconstruction of a better Gold Coast in which the people shall have the right to live and govern themselves as a free people. Point 6. To assist and facilitate in any way possible the realization of a united and self-governing West Africa. It was with this program that we launched the Convention's People's Party and started organizing for the struggle that lay ahead.